Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our first, in my memory, Friday night community gathering. And we really didn't plan it this way, although I think it's very popular. What happened is we had to work around the schedule of our speaker, but I think as it turned out to be a great idea. So thank you all for coming out tonight, especially the visitors. Welcome. We're Humanist MN. Secular nature, ethical, and purpose. I've had a beer, so I think I'm going to throw away my prepared remarks. Just welcome everybody. We are Humanist MN, and you can find us at humanistmn.org. And what we stand for is probably, if the people who've been members for a while or been following us at Meetup, we are a secular organization. Some of the pillars of our, the foundation of our group here is community service, social and economic justice, critical thinking, which we're going to talk about a lot more tonight, and camaraderie. So if these are the types of things that you're interested in as an individual, but are not part of our group, why don't you think about joining us? It's $40 a year, and we could really use your help. We're an all-volunteer organization. Nobody gets paid. We have all these great events. You'll see them on Meetup throughout the year. Terrific organization. You'll meet friends. You go to great events like we have tonight. And I just wanted to tell you that we have other events coming up. And I'm going to turn it over now to Audrey, who's going to talk about a couple events that we're going to have next week.
Okay, good evening, everyone. For a number of years, Humanist MN has been commemorating the National Day of Reason. And it's always the first Thursday, not a most convenient time for people, but the first Thursday of May. And originally it was designated that because that was the day of the National Day of Prayer. And the National Humanist Organization thought that we should counter that with a Day of Reason. And so that's why that date is there, which again is a Thursday. But for a long time, Humanist MN and the Minnesota Atheists joined together for an event in the Rotunda at the Capitol to commemorate that day. A few years ago, we decided as a humanist organization that we wanted to do something a little bit more robust and get legislators there and get our people out and do something more. So we had a reason breakfast and a reception for our legislators. We started that in 2019, had a wonderful success at the Capitol, and then the pandemic hit. And so the last couple of years we've tried to emulate that in some fashion online. But so we're very happy to be back at the Capitol this year. So it's next Thursday, May 5th. We start at 8:30 to 11. It's kind of a drop-in, come as you can. And so we really encourage people to come along. We have a number of legislators who have agreed to come and speak. Plus we're bringing in Sarah Levin, who is a national community secular organizer of an organization called Secular Strategies. She's a consultant as well as working for Sky Only Media. And she's going to speak about how secular people need to get organized. So again, it's a stop in as you can or stay for the whole time. It would be great if you could come, share the word, spread the word with others, because it's really important for our legislators to know that we are out there as secular people. All of you, I know, pay attention to what's happening in our country right now with the Christian right, with Christian nationalism, and the legislation that is being introduced at the Capitol to stop rights and to bring right-wing religious ideas into government. And we have got to show our presence. So if you are able to come that day, that would be really great. But if you can't, we've also planned an event for the evening before, Wednesday, May 4th, at a local brew pub, Ladonia, which is just not, I'm kind of confused in my directions here. It's just in the Harrison neighborhood, over here, just less than a mile away from where we are off of Glenwood Avenue, here in Minneapolis. A wonderful brew pub where we're going to, from 5 to 7, socialize together, and our guest speaker, who's coming in from California, will be there, Sarah Levin, to talk with us a little bit more informally, and we can ask her questions and sort of a meet and greet and just a wonderful social time. So again, 5 to 7, come over to Ladonia on Wednesday evening. Come to both if you can, and if you can show up on Thursday morning, that would be great. Thanks so much.
You know, I forgot to mention, and I'm going to surprise Ellie with this. We had a member drive, our first ever Humanist MN member drive, and it exceeded all expectations. Ellie, do you have just a minute to talk about that? I'm surprising her because I didn't tell her that we were going to call on her. Okay. Ellie is our vice president, and her husband Nick also is on the board of directors of Humanist MN.
Hi, I'm Ellie. So the first 2 weeks of April, we had our first ever member drive, and it coincided with a few other exciting marketing campaigns that we had. We had radio advertisements on KFAI, and we also had, they're still up, 2 billboards. One is in Northeast Minneapolis by the Red Stag, 1st and 5th, and the other one is by Cedar Riverside at 19th and Riverside. And so it was really exciting to be doing all of this stuff at once and just trying to get more visibility out there and see what we could make happen with this member drive, and it exceeded our expectations. We had about 30 new memberships, and some of those were households, so more than 30 new members, which is huge for an organization of our size. And so we got a lot of great feedback, and since we'd never done it before, we didn't know what to expect, but because we had this great response, I think it's going to be something that we'll hopefully do annually to some degree. And so thank you for everyone who referred friends, who kind of shared the word. We are so grateful for all of that. And for the new members that are here, thank you for coming. So, is that good?
I mentioned earlier that 2 of the foundations of our organization is our community service and social and environmental justice. And we have 2 co-chairs, Christine and Marcy, who lead that effort for us. They just do a terrific job. And in fact, there's postcards out there for a signing for your legislators. And maybe Christine or Marcy will talk about that. Christine, can you come up and talk about what is going on with humanists, and we call it Humanists in Action. We try to get people moving to do for economic justice, for social and economic justice, environmental justice, and for community service. And our co-chairs are going to talk to you about that right now.
Good evening, I'm Christine, and very pleased to be co-chair with my good friend Marcy in Humanists in Action. And we kind of focus on 2 angles. One is, as Harlan was mentioning, community service. And if you are on our meetup group, which you probably are, you see all the activities that we have and offerings to help our community. In this last few months and coming up, we did fixing bikes to get those 2 kids. We have made fleece blankets for youth in crisis. We did a river cleanup last weekend, a river bluff cleanup. And coming up now is part of the Secular Week, and we expanded it to Weeks of Action, showing what humanists do in the community. So when I reach out to an organization, I say, hi, I'm with Humanist MN, and we want to help. And they now know that word. They know who we are and what we do. We have a couple of other events coming up. I see Juliet. There's a highway cleanup, 35W. Find what interesting treasure you may come up with. You can do that. And then we have some other events coming up that we would like to have you participate in. If you have any wonderful ideas on how we can help in our community, any suggestions, things you've seen, please do contact us, socialaction@humanistmn.org. The other branch of what we do, kind of related to Audrey's discussion on the Day of Reason, is to advocate to our legislator and our government. And it's mostly we focus on state, but also a little federal, to champion causes and implement policies and laws that will help the community thrive. Some of the main causes we focus on are the environment, also end-of-life options, also voting access, various things. So if you're interested in participating in that, we do sometimes have meetups. We also we have a list of a newsletter we sent out to about 60 humanists have been interested in participating in that. We prompt them with actions of things we have heard of that, please reach out. And Marcy will mention, come on up and describe more about the postcard. So this is way, it's right there out there for you to speak your voice on a cause. And if you're interested in getting these alerts in the email, it's maybe once a week, if that. socialaction@humanistmn.org.
Thank you, Christine. I should also mention, besides my illustrious partner, we have a really great and active social action team. So I'm really happy that we have people who are interested in helping us. And if that's something that you're interested in, please find us and we'll hook you up. So on the table out there where some of you signed up for your free book drawing, I have 3 postcards. One is to Governor Walz, and one is addressed to Senator and Representative in Minnesota, and they're both geared toward environmental actions. A lot of things that we care about this session, such as reproductive justice, medical aid in dying, voting rights, pretty much got the kibosh, but some things that are still on the table are some environmental issues. So Governor Walz, the postcard pretty much is thanking him for supporting a good climate plan. I mean, it doesn't go far enough, but it's encouraging him to do so. And also to your Minnesota Senator Representative talking about some bills that are focused on getting the lead out of water in our state, and also some other environmental protections that will be discussed and bandied about, and hopefully some consensus reached when the 2 houses focus on the agriculture omnibus bill. So if you're interested in filling out a postcard and you don't know who your representative is or your senator, I can help you with that, but also I'm going to stamp them and mail them myself with the correct address. So all you need to know basically is your street address, and I'll take care of the rest. As Harlan and I believe Audrey mentioned, secular Americans, depending on what poll you look at, 20 to maybe 40% of the people in our country, non-religious, non-affiliated people. We are a powerful group of people, and we need to get our word out. We need to be heard. And so contacting your legislators, state and federal, is super important. And so hopefully this will help, and please do everything you can on your own as well. So thank you.
By the way, I want to give a shout out to our tech folks in back, John, Mitch, and Bob. We're on YouTube, and this is something we've started a few months ago, where we actually stream live to a number of people who've signed up to listen to this program on YouTube. And I want to mention, today we're going to talk about fake news and mental immunity. I read an article not too long ago, this past week, about a study that they were doing. Some of you may have heard about it, that a number of people were paid $15 an hour for 30 days, people who are Fox News viewers, to watch CNN for a month. And they started to deprogram them, and they found out that these people were much more discerning as far as being able to determine what's a fact and what is not. But I wondered, maybe they should do the reverse. Have people who watch MSNBC and CNN and watch Fox News. But the issue that I see is I don't think $15 would be enough for that. I would certainly demand more than that to spend 30 days watching Fox News. And anyway, on that note, I'd like to bring up Jerry, who's going. By the way, before I bring up Jerry, we're going to have the book drawing after the speaker and before the Q&A, and we'll announce the winner of the book drawing. Now I'd like to call up Jerry to introduce our speaker, Jerry Smith. My bad. Little piece of business we have to take care of. In the bylaws, we have to, next month is our annual meeting, and please everyone try to come next month. It'd be a very, very interesting time for you. But in the April meeting, we have to talk about the nominating committee, their work, who they have selected as nominees, and also call for other nominees. And I'm going to have Jerry do that tonight.
Thanks, Harlan. This year, the nominations committee consisted of David Gill, Mitch Thompson, and myself, Jerry Smith, with Mitch and I serving as co-chairs. Now, there are 4 at-large director positions to fill. One of those positions currently held by Seth Engman, who has agreed to serve another 2-year term and is being nominated for the same. Seth heads a monthly grief support meetup for us, and he also is a graphic designer whose talents show up in a lot of the things that we have. Another one of our current board members, David Gill, is eligible to serve 1 more year on the board, and we're nominating him to do that. David was formerly the secretary of the organization. He's an IT guy, and he's one of the real experts on our administrative systems. For instance, membership works. David is here. Could you stand up, David? That's the man. Vote for David. Thank you. The remaining 2 positions are currently occupied by Christine Rutqua and Marcy Woodruff, both of whom you just saw, both of whom have decided for personal reasons not to seek re-election to the board. Now, as most of you know and you just heard, Christine and Marcy are the leaders of our social action team, which is responsible for most of our community service and political advocacy activities. Each of them has contributed years of exceptional service to our organization, and happily, each has agreed to continue to serve as leaders of those activities even after they are no longer on the board. So at this time, I'd like us to thank Christine and Marcy for their outstanding contributions, past, present, and future. Please, Christine and Marcy, stand up and take some applause, well deserved. Thank you. Now, with Christine and Marcy continuing to be active in our organization, what at first seemed like a serious loss has been transformed into an opportunity, since we are now able to add 2 new members to the board. And as it turns out, we were able to find 2 members of the organization who've been active in various of our events and who are excited about contributing as board members. So I'm pleased to announce that the committee is nominating Abigail Jackson and Stephanie Schwinn to 2-year terms as at-large board members. And if you 2 would please stand up. These are, vote for Abigail and Stephanie. Thank you. Okay, as Harlan mentioned, the nominating committee does its stuff, has primary responsibility for finding and submitting candidates for positions on the board, but our bylaws provide opportunities for the general membership to do so as well. And in this regard, I'm now asking for and accepting nominations from the floor, i.e. you, for positions on our board. You can nominate yourself or another member of the organization who has agreed to serve. Does anyone care to make such a nomination? Going once, going twice. Hearing no more names of proposed candidates, I am hereby closing the nominations. Information on all of our candidates will be published in the May newsletter. The election will be held at our membership meeting in May, as Harlan said. I don't think it's been announced yet. I suspect it'll be on the 3rd Saturday of the month. Are there any questions or comments in regard to any of this? And thank you. Take a little around here. I'm back. My second role this evening is to introduce our speaker. Some of you may be familiar with Carnegie Mellon, a major research university located in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. In 2013, Carnegie Mellon launched a humanism initiative. They view humanism as an inclusive, value-centered philosophical outlook with which students can examine the human condition, scientific research, moral analysis, and more. The initiative has engaged in community building, education, and research. Our speaker this evening, Andy Norman, has from its inception been the director of this initiative, working in a variety of ways to bring humanism and the Carnegie Mellon community into a mutually beneficial relationship. Andy holds a PhD in philosophy from Northwestern University. He's taught philosophy at Carnegie Mellon, the University of Pittsburgh, and at Hamilton College. In addition to his many publications in peer-reviewed academic journals, Andy publishes regularly in Free Inquiry, The Humanist, and other secularist periodicals. He writes about reason and faith, secular ethics, critical thinking, and the philosophical foundations of humanism. Now, when our program committee began meeting last summer to plan monthly community gathering events for the coming year, Andy was on our short list of preferred speakers. The question is, how are we going to get this guy to come 1,000 miles to speak to us? Well, we subsequently found out that he was going to be in the Twin Cities this week to speak to the Minnesota Psychological Association, making some of us wonder, maybe there is a God. Never can tell. We jumped at the opportunity, and Andy graciously agreed to extend his stay in Minnesota for a day so he could speak to us this evening about his recent book, Mental Immunity. It's actually up there. Okay. Copies of the book are available for sale and will be signed by Andy after his presentation. So now, having done all the ado that I'm going to do, I'd like you to join me in welcoming tonight's speaker, Andy Norman.
Thanks, sir. I like that introduction. Thank you. Good evening. I was sent by God. Is the sound okay? Is the mic picking up? Everybody can hear? Okay, great. I can't tell you how nice it is to be back among fellow humanists. And I mean non-Zoom facsimiles of humanists, but real flesh and blood humanists. It's nice to see my people again. So, technical issues, hold on. Oh, I see. This is not advancing the way it was prior. Let me try it manually. Okay, so Mitch, if you could advance the slide. Okay, meet Fred. Fred's a flat earther. He passed away recently and found himself standing before God. He said, God, I've devoted my entire life to promoting flat earth theory, and now that it's over, I just have to know, is the world flat or is it round? God looks at him, does a face palm, and says, I'm sorry to say, Fred, but the world is very, very round. Fred looks at him and his eyes grow wide, and he says, this conspiracy goes higher than I thought. So what's wrong with Fred? Is he simply misinformed? Has he fallen down a rabbit hole? Is he unduly credulous, or is he unduly critical or suspicious? Is he uncritical or hypercritical? Does he have trust issues? Or does he maybe inhabit a compelling world where he sees through a hoax that fools all the rest of us? And is he mentally ill? These are some of the same questions I posed to my audience yesterday at the Minnesota Psychological Association. They were in favor of the mentally ill hypothesis. My question, of course, is academic because Fred isn't real. He's just my poster child for something that I think is a very real phenomenon. And matters of real consequence hinge on how we understand, diagnose, and treat this phenomenon. Mitch, if you would. So this man's mind was swarming with misconceptions about Jews and immigrants when he entered a synagogue just a few blocks from my home and killed 11 of my neighbors. It was the same building where my children attended daycare years before. This young man, his mind was swarming with misconceptions about black people and about race. He entered a church in Charleston, South Carolina, and killed 9 black parishioners, hoping to trigger a race war. I think about a year ago, this kid, Dylan Roof, appealed his conviction and death sentence and tried to make the case that he was not competent to stand trial, that he was mentally ill. The prosecution, of course, was trying to persuade people that no, that he wasn't mentally ill, he just harbored a lot of hateful ideas. I don't want to absolve Dylan Roof of anything, but it seems to me that the distinction between being mentally ill and being thoroughly addled by certain toxic ideas is, I think the distinction between the two gets awfully thin sometimes. In fact, I'm going to be arguing for the view that the wrong ideas can actually unhinge minds in very important ways. Mitch. These people harbor ridiculous notions about a cabal of Satan-worshipping pedophiles that they believe run our nation. A recent study showed that their belief system is now as widespread as some mainstream religions. These people believe a con man's lies about a stolen election, and they nearly ended American democracy. These headlines tell the tale of how Kremlin disinformation is tearing apart Russian families. Turns out that young Russians often get their news from social media or other apps and know that the invasion of Ukraine is immoral, but many of their parents believe what the state news tells them, that it's a virtuous war rather than a war of aggression. When these kids try to convince their parents, they find that their parents don't want to hear it. Of course, here in America, homegrown propaganda is dividing families and causing great turmoil as well. One of my philosophical counseling clients is a woman whose husband is a Proud Boy, and it's tearing their marriage apart. Mitch, so what's going on here? How should we think about these phenomena? In this talk, I'd like to share a potentially game-changing way of thinking about them, describe a new science, and begin exploring its implications for life in the digital age. I'm looking forward to discussing, so if questions occur to you, please do make a note of them. I'd love to hear them. If it's a question of clarification and you'd prefer I answer it before proceeding, wave your hand and I'll try to recognize you. It's a little hard to see you over the spotlights, but we'll be fine, I think. Okay, the science, Mitch, the science I refer to, I call it cognitive immunology, and define that phrase as the science of mental immunity to bad ideas. And by bad ideas, I mean misconceptions, misunderstandings, toxic ideologies, divisive ideologies, ideas and beliefs that don't serve us well, ideas and beliefs that cause us to do things that harm others. I think all of these things, misinformation and disinformation included, can rightfully be called bad information or bad ideas. And it turns out that our minds actually have resistance to these things to one or another degree, but we've never thought to study empirically the systems that protect our minds from these things. For about a century, we've been talking about critical thinking as the solution, but critical thinking is largely, I've spent much of my life teaching critical thinking, and I now believe that the science of mental immunity actually will allow us to take critical thinking instruction to a whole new level. By the way, many assume that the concept of a bad idea is off limits to scientists because, you know, bad is a subjective term. I think this is a myth, and I think it's a dangerous myth. The idea that scientists have to check their value judgments at the door, I think is wrong-headed, and I think we're actually evolving in the direction of a society where an actual science of morals is not just possible, but necessary. Think about the fact that immunology, the science of the body's immune system, that fundamentally changed our relationship to infectious microbes, where smallpox and diphtheria and dozens of other diseases used to cause enormous suffering. We now have very reliable ways of preventing those diseases from spreading, and it's no exaggeration to say that the science of immunology has actually freed us from some terrifying diseases. I think cognitive immunology, the immunology that studies not the body but the mind, that it's going to change our relationship to infectious information and free us from debilitating ideologies. At least it has the potential to do that. So this is my book. I wrote this book on the subject and published it almost exactly a year ago. In it, I show why in the information age we need to deepen our immunity to bad ideas and other bad information, and how we can do a much better job of it. And by the way, I think that the forgotten virtue of wisdom is in significant part a matter of having deep immunity to mistaken ideas. So I think that the concept of mental immunity gives us a new way to think about wisdom, and actually helps us operationalize the acquisition of wisdom. Gives us concrete steps we can take to get there. All good? Okay. So just as we can strengthen the body's immune system against infectious microbes, we can strengthen the mind's immune system against infectious viral information. And I think the new science of cognitive immunology is going to show us how. One of the implications of this science is that critical thinking skills are not enough, not by a long shot. There's a whole lot more to mental immune health than is dreamt of within the critical thinking paradigm. And critical thinking skills, actually think about it this way, right? If you teach a young person critical thinking skills and they just go out and put those skills to use in the service of some dogmatic ideology, it's not as though you've created a well-functioning mind, right? Critical thinking skills can be bent to many different purposes, some of them fundamentally antithetical to fair-mindedness or even open-mindedness. So there's more to mental immune health than just having critical thinking skills. So the science draws on decades of research on what psychologists have been calling mind inoculation. So back in the 1950s, I believe, the Korean War came to an end, and 9 American POWs were given their freedom, and they chose to stay in North Korea. Now, this was unthinkable that good red-blooded Americans would choose to stay in communist North Korea. So the assumption within the intelligence community was that they had been deeply brainwashed during their incarceration there. And so the intelligence community got really worried that the Russians and the North Koreans and other communist countries had advanced brainwashing techniques, and they started giving out big government grants to psychologists to study what they call influence campaigns, brainwashing basically. And a psychologist named William McGuire discovered something fascinating. He discovered that if you expose a mind to a weakened form of an argument, the mind will often become resistant to even stronger versions of the same argument. Do you see the analogy here with how inoculation works? So the way you inoculate the body against, say, COVID, is to create a vaccine that contains a weakened form of the coronavirus. And the weakened form of the coronavirus teaches the body's immune system what to look for, so it can profile the actual full-strength version of the coronavirus if it ever does come along. And your body's immune system learns how to attack and defeat the coronavirus. Turns out something fascinatingly similar is happening in our minds, and you can use it to hack minds, so to speak. You can make arguments for secularism, treat them as silly. Like, take straw man versions of all of your favorite arguments for humanism or secularism, expose them to a young, impressionable Christian, and then when that Christian grows up and they hear the full-strength version of those same arguments, the ones that a fair-minded person might give, their minds will dismiss them as ridiculous because they've been inoculated by the earlier versions of those arguments that they encountered. So McGuire's research program was actually, how do we inoculate minds against new information? It was a peculiarly amoral project. In fact, if the intelligence community could inoculate minds against communist ideas, they were going to do it, right or wrong, right? But a new wave of inoculation researchers that's just been doing some really fascinating research in the last couple of decades has discovered that you can inoculate minds against misconceptions, against conspiracy thinking. You can inoculate minds against extremism. You can inoculate minds against climate denial. We're still struggling to come up with interventions that have a lasting effect. So if you can inoculate a mind against, a young mind against climate denial, and the effect might last for months or years, but enough exposure to Fox News, turns out, will interfere with that. So we're still working out some of the kinks. Interesting example of this from recent headlines. You probably came across this in one or more of the news outlets you read about. Turns out the Biden administration got intelligence that Putin was planning to invade Ukraine months before it happened. And they had time to think about, how are we going to counter Putin's preferred narrative about this invasion of Ukraine? And they decided early on that we're going to start inoculating the world's population against Putin's preferred narrative. And they started saying, watch out everybody, Putin, false narrative coming from Russia, don't buy it. This is actually a war of aggression, and don't believe otherwise. And you know what? It worked. The Washington bureau chief of The Economist learned that I did research in this area, and he called me because he suspected that there was some fascinating psychological wizardry going on in this behind the Biden campaign's effort. And so I told him about mind inoculation. It's also called pre-bunking. You can debunk after the fact, or you can pre-bunk before somebody buys into a false narrative. Is that a hint?
Yeah. Talking about ideas like this and like disinformation and treating it like a virus is, to me, very similar how Dr. Darrell Ray talks about like certain like elements of Christianity as being like, in his book, the God virus.
Okay.
And I'm just wondering if that was ever something that you like took inspiration from.
I don't know this work, actually. I think I've seen the title. And
Can you repeat the question for the home audience?
Yeah, I said the way that you're talking about this kind of information.
No, I think have the speaker repeat.
oh, I'm sorry.
Because-
Thank you.
Because we have people listening at home. And that cannot be the question. unless
Daryl Ray?
speaking to-
Yeah, Dr. Galloway, yeah.
Gotcha. Okay, yeah. I'll try to remember to repeat back the questions. So apparently there's a book out by a man named Daryl Ray called Dr. Daryl Ray called The God Virus. I know nothing about it, except that it seems to be playing in the same sandbox that I am.
Very, very similar.
Okay. I'm eager to learn more. Maybe we can talk more about that.
I'm going to have a question and answer period after the speaker's finished.
Okay. So let me sum up in a very simple form the gist of what we're drawing from some of this. There are now hundreds of studies indicating that the mind actually seems to have an immune system that can be weakened or strengthened. And here's basically what you need to know. I think a much-needed paradigm shift is coming, and that those who can shift their perspective on information and how we relate to information, they're going to adapt more quickly to our brave new digital world. And those who are unable to make this mental shift, I think, are really going to struggle. Let me talk about that a little bit. So here's what I think is the prevailing picture of our relationship with information or with ideas. The space of ideas is like a marketplace. We even talk about the marketplace of ideas. That phrase has been around and been very influential for centuries now, since the beginning of the Enlightenment. But now, of course, we experience the space of ideas when we go online, almost like like information and ideas almost seem like commodities. You browse the internet for the stuff you want, and I think that growing up in a world like that, it's very easy to imagine that the world of ideas, something that Plato and philosophers have been thinking about for a very long time, is fundamentally like a quickie mart or something. On this view, ideas and information are like groceries. They're well-behaved commodities that sit obediently on shelves and that are fundamentally at our disposal. Minds, meanwhile, are like shopping carts, containers for the ideas we fancy. Learning is a matter of adding to the mind's knowledge stockpile or the mind's information stockpile. It's kind of like putting groceries into your cart. And your beliefs are like the ideas you buy into. Whatever ideas you buy into, those are your beliefs. And by the way, I chose an image here with fruits and vegetables filling the cart because almost every one of us fancies that we fill our own minds with health food, even when we're filling our minds with junk food, right? Or the junk food of the mind. One more time. And on this view, we ourselves have a right to dispose of our credulity, just as consumers have a right to dispose of their dollars, however they see fit. What do we say? We say everyone is entitled to their opinion. I think this idea, which has been around again since the beginning of the Enlightenment, has created a highly decadent culture where we all are almost spoiled by our sense of cognitive entitlement. We emphasize cognitive rights to the exclusion of cognitive responsibilities, present company excluded, of course. And it has many harmful effects. So I want to call this entire frame the Infomart Frame, and I think that it is hugely problematic. I think it's deeply inaccurate to the nature of the relationship we have to ideas and information. I think it's morally disorienting, in part because of that imbalance between emphasis on rights and responsibilities. I think it feeds polarization. Think about it. If you live in a world where everybody's entitled to their opinion and nobody really recognizes shared norms of responsible believing, belief systems drift apart. And if they drift far enough apart, then actually having a constructive conversation with people on the other side becomes really difficult. And so I think America right now is more polarized than at any time since they've been trying to measure it, and it's really scary that there's very little sense that we might have common obligations with regard to belief maintenance and belief updating. Think about it, and I believe that the same framework actually excuses closed-mindedness and ideological rigidity as well. Think about this aspect of the idea that everyone has a right to their opinion. Rights are things that are supposed to be, you're not supposed to disturb people's rights. The concept of a right is supposed to protect things from disturbance. And so a right to your belief means that you're transgressing against me if you disturb my beliefs. And if you come along with critical questions, you humanists, you're disturbing people's beliefs, which is actually transgressing against a right, and we're conditioned to treat rights as almost sacred. So critical thinking is in fact a transgression of a profound right. The logic behind the idea that we're entitled to our opinion just spools out very quickly and straightforwardly to the conclusion that challenging other people's ideas is transgressive. Now, the founders of the Enlightenment knew that freedom of conscience didn't mean we shouldn't challenge each other's beliefs, but we've lost sight of that in our culture today, and many people actually get angry and feel as though you're infringing on their freedoms if you challenge their points of view. And that's not a healthy situation. So what's the alternative to this Infomart frame? I want to call it the mental immunity frame. The idea here is that the space of ideas, in the infosphere, if you will, it's more like an ecosystem than a mini-mart. Ideas are more like microbes. Mitch? Ideas are more like microbes than groceries. And they're, in some ways, unruly critters that can go viral, that can go viral and take on a life of their own and spread in ways that no one of us can control. And of course, there are many ideas that actually harm their hosts. Some ideas actually use their hosts. Here's a very clear example from my book. Think about the idea that you should strap on an explosive vest and go blow up a bunch of infidels. That idea has a tendency to destroy the very mind that hosts it. So you'd think it would be a losing strategy for an idea, and yet it manages to propagate even so, sometimes. How? By inspiring copycats. If the act of blowing yourself up around a bunch of infidels inspires others to do the same, the idea can spread even while it's using and destroying its host. Yeah? And by the way, I think every bad idea can be properly thought of as a mind parasite. The idea that smoking is okay, you're going to pay a price if you harbor that idea. Maybe it's worth, maybe you're willing to pay that price, but there are many, many bad ideas that that detract from our well-being, and scientists now are cognitive scientists are taking very seriously the idea that mind parasites exist. In fact, some of my friends have actually shown that the spread of witchcraft beliefs in early modern Europe is best understood as a case of cognitive contagion, like we often talk about as a hysterical fear of witches spreading. Well, it turns out that you can use the principles of epidemiology to model that, and it actually predicts with surprising accuracy the way in which those ideas spread through early modern Europe. Mitch, if you would. So I'm going to say that bad ideas are actual mind parasites. This is a claim I defend in the book, and I showed that it's time that scientists actually woke up to the literal truth of this claim and started taking the viral properties of some infobugs seriously, because we can't keep treating them as though they're simply obedient slaves for our minds, when in fact they're busy running around infecting minds, disorienting minds, hijacking minds, and worse. So I think cognitive contagion is real. I think mind infections are common. And if you would, I should back up a second. Minds themselves are actually in something like infection-prone colonies of ideas. The philosopher Daniel Dennett has actually argued that ideas build minds in some very significant sense. I think he's right about that, or at least there's a fair amount of truth to that. And just in the same way that our evolved bodies are prone to infection, our minds have also evolved through evolutionary time, and they too are prone to infection by infobugs. Fortunately, Mitch, I'm sorry, so those little arrows represent mind infections happening, but the blinky white line is supposed to represent the mind's immune system, which protects us, again, to one or another degree, from the infobugs out there. When they're working well, Mitch, they ward off disorienting ideologies and conspiracy theories and limiting assumptions. And propaganda. And when working well, they also protect us against misconceptions, misinformation, that kind of thing. But of course, no one of us has a mental immune system that functions perfectly. Every single one of us harbors mind parasites. Every single one of us needs to be humble enough to recognize that we may have to unlearn some things we thought we knew. Philosophers have been trying to persuade the rest of humanity to take a much more humble attitude towards the idea that we know a lot of stuff, because they recognize that our mind's this is my way of putting it, but critical thinking, or the mind's immune system, functions better when you're humble. When you become arrogant, think you have all the answers, and you're unwilling to rethink the ideas that have already sunk roots into your mind, dogma sets in, closed-mindedness sets in, you stop learning. And I think, again, all of this can be properly modeled in immunological terms. Mitch? Thank you. Okay. So just to sum up then, the science of mental immunity is actually showing us some fascinating things. Mental immune systems exist. There are, in fact, structures of the mind meant to protect us from the wrong ideas. And the mind actually generates antibodies to fight off mind infections. Any of you heard of Ilya Mechnikov? He's a Russian zoologist who about a century ago he was really interested in how the body heals itself. And so he took a citrus thorn and he stabbed a starfish larva and he stuck it under a microscope. And he watched in amazement as white blood cells, the larva's blood cells, rushed to the scene of the injury, surrounded the tip of the thorn, and began to consume it. He called them phagocytes, which means things that devour. And he hypothesized that the body has a system of antibodies that actually is like a mobile army that fights off invaders. And he turned out to be right. He was in some ways the father of immunology, or understanding of the mechanisms that underlie immunology. Next time you are exposed to a really offensive or challenging or disturbing idea, pay close attention to what happens in your mind. What you may very well find is that your mind sends doubts to surround and neutralize the new information. That's the mind's immune system in action, and you can observe it happening in your own mind. If every time somebody spews Trumpian hate near you, you immediately think of 17 reasons why they're idiots, that's your mind's immune system in action, trying to protect you from information that it regards as a threat. Turns out the mind's mental immune disorders exist. There are different kinds of mental immune disorders. You know how the body's immune system can fail in one of two ways. It can become underactive and fail to fight off invading microbes, or it can become overactive and attack the body's own tissues. The second type of failing is called autoimmunity. It's associated with hyperactive, like gluten intolerance, celiac disease. That's an autoimmune disorder. It's the body overreacting. In fact, any of you have hay fever? Suffer from seasonal allergies? That's your immune system overreacting to something that isn't really a threat. Pollen doesn't really harm your body, but your immune system worries that it might, freaks out, and that's what makes you miserable. Well, and I think the mind's immune system can freak out, overreact to a perceived threat, and cause us to think in skewed ways. When you feel embattled, when you feel endangered, when you feel threatened by something, the signal goes first to a part of the brain called the amygdala. The amygdala assesses the information to see if there's a clear and present danger or a threat. And if it determines that you are under attack or under threat, it basically switches off your forebrain, the part of your brain that's good for critical thinking and higher level reasoning. And it just basically says, fight or flee. Time to fight or flight. And when our minds are in that mode, I forget if that's called if that's the activation of, I think that's called the activation of the sympathetic nervous system. When that happens, we become defensive and angry and incapable of having a fruitful dialogue with other people. And the key to actually calming yourself down so that you can have a constructive conversation with somebody is to activate the parasympathetic nervous system, another part of the nervous system that basically says, you know what, I'm safe enough to actually think this through at my leisure. Let's calm down and try to think about this rationally. Deep breathing, meditation, yoga, all of these things actually trigger the parasympathetic nervous system and give your forebrain a chance to actually do its job. But when you're constantly freaked out about the state of American politics and what's the crazy right going to do, the Christian nationalists going to do next, when you feel endangered by all that, it's very hard to be your best kind of as a thinker. And I know I struggle with this all the time. So just as mental immune systems can be disturbed and disrupted by the wrong ideas, they can also be strengthened and enhanced and fortified by others. So in my book, I identify several ideas that I believe are actually mental immune disruptors. And the idea that everyone is entitled to your opinion, if you use that idea to just defend any arbitrary belief that strikes your fancy, it's actually disturbing, interfering with your mind's immune system, your mind's ability to assess that idea and decide if it really merits acceptance. I actually think the idea that values are subjective is also a mental immune disruptor that has a great deal of currency in our world, and it causes us to not think deeply about moral questions. Oh well, values are all just subjective. You think X, I think Y, what are we going to do? End of discussion. Philosophers for thousands of years have known that relativism, the idea that values are all just relative or all just subjective, has a disturbing tendency to shut down value inquiry before it can really get going. And unfortunately, relativistic ideas are widespread in our culture today, and I argue that the best way to understand relativism, it's a immune disruptive complex of mind-parasites. Okay, Mitch. The response to my book's publication has been so gratifying. I was contacted by many of the leading inoculation theorists, and they said, you know, Andy, we need to turn this into both a research program and an attempt to apply the findings of that research program to you know, help beat back the seeming tidal wave of mis and disinformation. So I founded a research institute called CIRCE, the Cognitive Immunology Research Collaborative. We just got our first big grant, which is really cool, but all of this has happened in just a few months. And our mission is to advance the science of mental immunity, to develop humanity's resistance to the worst forms of cognitive contagion, and build a world where infodemics, outbreaks of unreason, no longer frustrate human aspirations. You can learn more about this institute by going to cognitivimmunology.net, and if you think this is an important work, we would very much, we need allies and supporters. So, let me mention a few key findings from the science of mental immunity, and then some of their practical implications. Sorry, Mitch. Thank you. So mental immune disruptive ideas and mental immune disruptive conditions abound. Turns out that mental immune systems can be hotwired with what some people are calling manufactured cynicism. You may remember this. Do you remember when Steve Bannon was on a podcast or something, and somebody asked him, how do you work your magic? And he said, basically, I flood the zone with shit. What he meant was, you don't even have to present a coherent counter-ideology to what the Democrats are offering. You just send out so many conflicting, incoherent, nonsensical messages that people get confused and despair of ever actually figuring out what's really true and just stopping to care about what's really true. Bannon had figured out and applied this finding to Trump's campaign that you can basically hijack mental immune systems so that people stop thinking critically about stuff. And simple confusion, simply having Fox News say the opposite of what MSNBC says leads a lot of people to say, oh, well, what can we do? I can't figure this out. Might as well vote for the authoritarian. I don't know quite how their thinking works, but. I mentioned earlier that critical thinking is not enough. Critical thinking skills are certainly not enough. I actually think that fair-mindedness is a key part of mental immune health. I think open-mindedness, flexibility, mental suppleness, that these are also important elements of mental immune health. And I think it's time we updated our approach to teaching critical thinking so that it bestows the full range of sort of relevant aptitudes. Turns out, this is, I think, a finding that you guys will probably resonate with, or maybe find threatening even. Turns out that belief-based identities can compromise your mind's immune system. So here's how it works. Hitch your identity to a certain set of beliefs, and then when somebody comes along and challenges those beliefs, you feel attacked because those ideas are part of who you are. So you get defensive, your mind's immune system freaks out, the fight or flight reflex kicks in, and you can't be the wisest version of yourself. Now, I identify as a humanist, and when somebody challenges humanism, I have to remind myself, don't freak out. Challenges are good. They can actually teach you things sometimes, lots of times. I actually argued that practicing the art of treating challenges as opportunities rather than threats is a really nice way to kind of strengthen your own openness to learning new things from other perspectives. But you have to fight down that defensive fear reaction that often sets in first. I argue in the book that we should treat our beliefs as house guests that might wear out their welcome at some point. Maybe as humanists, you believe, as I do, that human rights are really important. Okay. Maybe that house guest should be welcomed and tolerated in your mind for a while, but you might at some point decide that that idea is a little too simple, a little too cookie cutter, and that it actually needs to be modified. There are certainly a lot of people out there who are free speech absolutists, for example, and who need to think about rights in a more nuanced way. That doesn't mean that the idea of human rights is a mind parasite necessarily, but particularly clumsy versions of the idea might qualify on my way of thinking about it. I think that belonging to a community of inquiry affords a certain degree of protection. So to the extent that you, as members of this, do you call yourselves a congregation, community? Community. To the extent that you get together and think about stuff, get together and question each other, get together and test each other's ideas, and to the extent that you feel like you belong to a group that values doing that, I think that that gives you much more protection against infectious ideologies than many of our fellow countrymen enjoy. It certainly gives more protection than those who opt for belief-based belonging. Did I mention the concept of pre-bunking before? Biden's attempt to preempt Putin's preferred narrative on Ukraine. The researchers are calling that pre-bunking rather than debunking, and it turns out that pre-bunking is easier than debunking. I like to say that, what do they say, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure? Well, an ounce of mind inoculation is worth a pound or maybe a ton of cult deprogramming. It's really hard to deprogram a QAnon member and relatively easy to inoculate them against QAnon sense, as I think about it. If you get there first, right? Okay, almost done here. Here are a few practical implications of cognitive immunology as I understand it. Handle ideas with care. They're not simple, well-behaved, not always simple, well-behaved entities that serve you well. Some ideas can take on a life of their own and harm their hosts. And I think they're fundamentally more unruly than we like to think. And some ideas, of course, rewire our brains in ways that can turn us into synagogue shooters or suicide bombers. Second lesson, listen to your doubts. Many people are uncomfortable with doubt, but on this mental immunity frame that I'm urging, it turns out doubts are actually your mind's antibodies. They're there to defend your mind against the bad stuff. Give them time to convince you that maybe that information isn't all that it seems to be. If you listen to sometimes that little voice in the back of your head that says, something's not quite right here, a lot of times you'll spot a mind parasite that others miss. I believe that the famous Socratic Method, the approach the Greek philosopher Socrates used to cross-examining his fellow Athenians, I believe that's one of the most powerful mind inoculants ever invented. And that if you learn the art of asking clarifying questions, it goes something like this. When somebody says something you don't like, we're apt to think, that's wrong, and here's why. But if you instead go, slow down that process and say, gee, I wonder if I heard that right. Do I really understand what you're saying? Could you clarify that for a second and define your terms a little bit? Because I want to make sure I understand this before I condemn it. If you're slow to judge and resort first and foremost to clarifying questions rather than objections and challenges, you'll find your conversations go much better. And I think your mind's immune system gets stronger. I think that's one of the hidden virtues of the Socratic Method. And so I'm promoting something I call the new Socratic Method, which is kind of a updated 21st century cognitive immunology inspired version of the famous Socratic approach to protecting minds from bad ideas. I think many of you probably have an intuitive sense of the importance of this, that arbitrary believing is not okay, right? So if you're brought up in certain doctrinaire religious beliefs, you're probably taught to think, these are our ideas, and they may be arbitrary, but they're ours. And it's okay to believe them because you're one of us. Humanists, I think, are more prone to the idea that it's not okay to indulge in arbitrary believing because that might set you at odds with people who believe in other arbitrary things. If we all buy into the idea that our beliefs should be non-arbitrary, evidence-based, say, or at least responsible based on some shared standards, then we have mechanisms in place for solving the polarization problem, ways of bringing our belief systems back into alignment. Many a nation, many an empire has fallen because belief systems grew too far apart and resulted in sectarian violence and spelled the end. And I fear that's happening in our country. And if we don't learn to have what I call sort of bridging dialogue, again, our nation could go the way of the Roman Empire. I think that the norms of accountable talk are an especially precious inheritance. Almost all of us have grown up in a time of unprecedented peace and prosperity, in large part because we are descended from Enlightenment thinkers who thought that norms of accountable talk are important. They called it reason. And that they allow for so much constructive dialogue, conflict resolution, problem solving, science, and almost everything we cherish and value in the world is supported and, I think, enhanced by the norms of accountable talk. And when Donald Trump comes along and simply tramples those norms at every opportunity, and his supporters, just thrill at the fact that he's trampling the norms that these liberal commies have been wielding over us all this time, they're actually reveling in the very thing that's causing our culture to decline. We have to find a way to cherish and rebuild and strengthen the norms of accountable talking and accountable thinking. Last point, those of us who fancy ourselves rationalists or critical thinkers or humanists are often tempted to think of the flat earthers of the world as uncritical thinkers. But it turns out, I have a good friend who was a philosopher of science who studies science denial, and he went undercover at a flat earth convention. Yeah, well, and he tried to actually reason with these folks. Where was I going with this? What he found was that some of the most prominent flat earthers are not dumb. Some of them are enormously clever. And they're not uncritical. In fact, they're far more critical than you and I are of things you and I take for granted. It's just that they're critical about the wrong things. In fact, they're hypercritical about things they should be relatively uncritical about, And they're uncritical about things they should be more critical about. So the secret to actually developing a healthy mind is not to just be indiscriminately more critical. And if to the extent that you buy into the idea that being more critical is better, if the critical thinking paradigm leads you to think we should all just be more critical, you bought into something that is creating a deep imbalance, because indiscriminate doubt is just as debilitating as arbitrary belief. And many of the worst conspiracy theories out there, flat earth belief, are a result of runaway doubt, spiraling questions that spiral out of control. We have to learn to ask not more questions necessarily, but the right questions. Okay, I think, if you would, I'm happy to wrap up here. I'd love to know what you guys think. Thank you very much for your attention. You could use this if you like.
There we go. Well, thank you so much. Now we're going to have a question. Well, before we have a question and answer period, we're going to have the results of our drawing. And I'm going to call up Marcy. You may recall earlier in the evening, many of you signed or put your name on a piece of paper.
Would you do us the honor of drawing?
Would you like to do the drawing, Mr. Norman?
So I'm
Professor Norman?
random. All right, the last one, you mean yours? Dave Hendrickson.
Dave, you are the winner of the book. Okay, thank you, Marcy. Well, instead of me walking around with a microphone, if you have a question, why don't you just come up. And because we have the cameras too, we'd like for the cameras to catch you as well, and address your question to Mr. Norman. Marcy has the first question.
Hi, thank you very much. My question is, basically, I understand what you're saying. I think it's fabulous. A lot of our communication is done online and social media where it's difficult to have good conversations. I don't like it, but that's how we communicate on 280 characters or on Facebook, or it's difficult sometimes to have good conversations there. Do you have any suggestions for that, combating some of the mental bugs that way?
Thank you for that question. I have no doubt that the internet and social media are a significant part of what's causing thinking to go haywire these days, right? People can end up in, what do they call them, filter bubbles, where they're only hearing certain warped points of view, and then they actually start believing those warped points of view. Twitter does not seem to me to be a particularly well-designed space for constructive conversations, and I have zero faith that Elon Musk will make it more so. In fact, Elon Musk is showing all the signs of being what I call a free speech absolutist, or something close to it, where he thinks protecting speech rights is the only thing that matters, and doesn't recognize that speech responsibilities and accountability norms also matter. People die when hate speech thrives. People die. They lose a fundamental right. And it's not okay to just say that any speech is okay. That's just too simplistic. There are many people who are trying to think this problem through. They're studying how misinformation and hate spread online. It's a boom field among scholars now. And they're trying to, on the one hand, spot infodemics when they start and figure out how to disrupt them in various ways. Better designed information spaces, better designed social media platforms is probably part of the solution. And it seems to me that the space of reasons, the space of ideas where we actually talk together and try to work through our differences, I experience that space as almost sacred. I don't want it to be commodified and turned into something that makes billionaires even wealthier. I think that if there's in the same way that our ancestors judged the interstate highway system and sewage, public sewage, as a public good to be built and protected and nurtured and by entities meant to protect all of us. That's probably the right way to protect the infosphere against, information profiteers and demagogues and propagandists. I don't have any easy answers, though.
So we discussed your book there just a few weeks ago, and I really liked your idea of win-win dialogue, that if we could practice those ideas and make our discussions more productive. But one thing that really captured my attention, there's one paragraph where you mentioned that people in the religious right have a real harsh discipline towards their children. They spank them a lot. I thought, wow, that means they're going to grow up to adults that have a real reservoir of anger. Yeah. It could explain a lot of issues, from the very malignant Islamic terrorists to Christian nationalist hate groups to the more benign QAnon people. I was wondering if you could expand on that paragraph some.
I will, and I'm happy you mentioned it. Thank you, sir. So I tell the story in the book of a high-profile public debate between Bill Nye, the science guy, and Ken Ham, the founder of Answers in Genesis. So this would happen in 2014 in Petersboro, Kentucky. It happened at the Creation Museum, I believe, that Ham had founded. And Ham defended the view that the book of Genesis contains a literally true account of our origins, and Ham and Nye tried to show that that was a scientifically untenable stance. And of course, neither one persuaded the other. But during the Q&A, the moderator asked both men, "What would change your mind?" Wonderful question, by the way. And Nye said, "Evidence." Give me good evidence that, that we didn't evolve according to natural selection, and I'll believe it. It was a beautiful expression of what I call the sort of the scientific attitude. Give me good evidence and I'll change my mind. And then it was Ham's turn, and he said, "Nothing. Nothing will ever convince me that the Word of God is not true," thereby displaying what some of the people in the audience thought was an admirable tenacity, and to me betraying an unforgivable degree of closed-mindedness. So I argue in the book that Ham's mind's immune system had been profoundly compromised by his Christian faith. And then in a follow-up, I actually show how a mind compromised by religious faith can actually become morally disoriented. So Ham himself argues that we should beat and spank our children because it's a God-ordained method of instruction. It's right there in the Bible: spare the rod, you spoil the child. So he's actually published articles encouraging Christians to beat their children, because that's the way to keep Satan at bay. And that just seems to me to be patently immoral, and it seems to me very good evidence that a faith-based attitude can actually disorient us morally, can unhinge our minds in ways that make us less moral. So it's not just that I certainly don't believe that you need faith to be moral. Here's a very clear case of faith causing somebody to be far more immoral than he might otherwise be. Where's the guy who asked that question? Thank you, sir.
Hi, thank you. I was taken by your comments about doubt and about not taking arbitrary belief as though that's a choice. So here's my question. In some of my readings, I understand that the brain is predominantly a predictive organ, and that there is actually a neurological aspect of that which is to impart a sense of certainty about things.
Yes.
And that you may have a very strong sense of certainty, in which case you might be very prone to believing things, or you may have a weaker sense of certainty where you might be more doubtful of things. So I guess my question is, do you think that exists, that neurological genetic predisposition to certainty exists for people, and how does that relate to the idea that you can choose one way or the other?
Yeah, wow, great question. I believe psychologists have found that they can measure something that they call openness to new experiences or something like that. You're familiar with Carol Dweck's work about growth mindsets and fixed mindsets? She's found that she has the survey instrument that you answer a bunch of questions, and it determines whether you have a fundamentally open growth mindset or a fixed mindset. And it turns out that having an open mindset is correlated with success in so many aspects of life. And having a fixed mindset, like Canahan, corresponds with all kinds of social and moral and dysfunction and worse outcomes. So if you, and it could be that there's a genetic component. I believe that we probably all are all born somewhere on the continuum between completely closed and completely growth-oriented. And my guess is culture can have a pretty significant impact on how it shifts over time. I imagine that if you grow up in a community that threatens you with eternal hellfire, if you ever think for yourself, you're likely to end up far more closed-minded. I was once contacted by a woman who grew up in an evangelical community, was sent to college, and for the first time she was taught to believe in hell. And for the first time, her college professors were encouraging her to actually ask questions about hell and God's existence. And she said that she really wanted to, because she really loved the conversations she would get in when she was thinking about these things, but she said she couldn't fight down the sense of existential panic, that she might end up burning in fire. She knew hell was nonsense, but the sense of panic wouldn't abate. This woman dropped out of school and gave up college because she couldn't handle it emotionally. Critical thinking was itself, she'd been incapacitated for critical thinking by the myth of hell. Her story just fills me with sadness. She was such a bright, interesting, curious woman, and somehow her mind had been poisoned against freedom of inquiry and actual thinking for yourself.
So I was one of the people that participated in the book club that we had Tuesday night virtually online that discussed your book. And it made a lot of sense to me as far as, I grew up in rural Minnesota, Catholic family, 8 kids, and it's just been curious to me at this point in my life in the last, couple decades, how we've diverged. Out of the 8 of us, there's maybe 3 liberal kind of people, and 3 at least that are pretty, and then some that are kind of muddle up. But
yeah, in your family, you mean?
What? Yeah, yeah, in my family, and with the advent of Donald Trump and stuff, the more religious, the more you support him, and it makes no sense to me.
Yeah.
But it does seem like, the ones that held on, I had this sudden insight when I was 17 in church of all places that, World Without God made a lot more sense. And so I went to college, even though it was a Catholic college, with that idea, and I kind of was in the sciencey field and medical field and stuff. And but But then even my one brother who got a 4-year degree at the U in agriculture went back to the small town, and he's all kind of confused, in my opinion, as well. So it's just kind of interesting. But I was reading your book, and some of your ways of dialoguing with people kind of made sense, and I found myself doing that a little bit with even people online who, are crazily still Trumpers and things like that.
Okay.
And I just think we need to I wish there was a way we could, maybe as an organization or, doing it online, kind of practice doing that dialogue that you discussed, the new...
I call it the new Socratic Method.
Yeah, where you can't have regressive why questions because that doesn't get you anywhere. You have to arrive at some understanding of some truths and stuff. And I could see that made sense, but I'd like to see it in action. And so I guess,
yeah,
group, if maybe that would be a next step in this whole reading the book and having this discussion. To kind of advance that.
Thank you for that. I'm gratified that you're interested in this new Socratic method. My colleagues and I have come up with we've tried to simplify the process of seeking clarity before you judge another point of view. So Socrates was a master at asking the questions that clarified your commitments and your in your belief system, and exposing the conflicts in your belief system so that you were motivated to change yourself. He was the way he's depicted in some of Plato's dialogues are beautiful. So we've taken him as inspiration. I've come up with a 1-page guide to practicing the new Socratic method. I'd be happy to share that guide with you guys. I can send a PDF to Jerry, say, and he can share it with you guys. I just created a version of it for this Minnesota Psychological Association, people who want to help their clients. So I think they're clinical applications of the new Socratic method. And then when I get back to Pittsburgh tomorrow, I jump on a plane the next day and go to an Air Force base in Tennessee, where the commander is concerned that the right-wingers and the left-wingers can't work together anymore to fulfill their mission, and he's begging me to help them learn how to talk together and actually hear and respect one another. So I've developed a version of the new Socratic method for them. It sounds like maybe the bridging version of the new Socratic method might be the best might be the better fit for what you're asking. Be happy to share that. It's certainly, it's a simple, it's like training wheels. It's a simple way to kind of get started becoming your own version of Socrates, but then you need to, at some point, take the training wheels off and go by feel.
Okay, we'll take a couple more questions, and then we'll retreat back to the lobby and have the book signing. We also have coffee and cookies for those who'd like to stick around, continue our social hour, and have a chance to talk with Andy, and perhaps sign postcards as well. You heard about the postcards that Marcy talked about earlier. They'll be there.
Given the theme of your book, comparing ideas, beliefs, ideologies, and some cases even like entire lifestyles to viruses, that alone right there can invoke in people a really negative feeling. Now add on to that the last 2 years of the very same people who you're calling out in your book, in your speech up here, are actively campaigning against the idea of antivirus, vaccines, and immunization. I would imagine that has had a really strong counter effect to your ideas, to your book. If so, how are you adapting to that? How are you combating the very idea of demonizing inoculation itself?
Yeah, this is a really good question. I think I'm hearing a couple questions there. What's your name? What's your name, sir?
Ren.
Ren, thank you, Ren. So one legitimate fear that arises, I think, when you spread the idea that mind-parasites are real, and that exposure to them might result in mind infections, that can cause people to freak out and get really, and like, oh, we better build walls between me and those infectious ideas, and especially my kids and those infectious ideas, because if they get exposed to those infectious ideas, you know, they might, I don't know, become humanists or something awful like that, right? I think history tells a long and very sad story about what I'll call ideological barrier building. Trying to build walls between dangerous ideas and the people they might otherwise infect has almost always led those who guard the walls to become freaked out and authoritarian and doctrinaire and even tyrannical. So there is a danger here. You're right, Ren. There is a danger that the metaphor that I'm promoting could have an adverse effect on some, induce a fear reaction in some. In the book, I argue that I'm not in favor of building walls between people and ideas regarded as dangerous. The alternative is really to build up our mental immune system so that we can spot them as nonsense and dismiss them as nonsense. I think that's a far more humane. The first path can lead to a thought police. And we don't want that. But the second path needn't. So I have an entire book called, an entire chapter of the book is titled "Thought Police Need Not Apply," where I try to show that that we need to become, we need accountability norms. We need standards for thinking well. And whenever you apply those norms or standards, some people are going to say, "You're being a thought police. You're advocating for thought police." There have to be ways of inoculating each other against bad ideas that fall short of that don't have the same dangers. And I'm trying to steer that path. Wonderful question about possible danger here, and I'm alive to the danger there. There was another element to your question. Of course, a lot of people right now have become anti-vaccine, and they're the last people who are going to buy my book or read it or take its ideas seriously. And I don't imagine I didn't write it for them. I wrote it for folks who are more open to the idea. I think it's going to take, I think the people, those of us who can see the worth of these ideas can begin to internalize them in ways that change the way we interact with one another and deepen our own capacity to spot bad ideas and gently help others let go of them. And if that happens and it spreads through the culture, then the next generation of might-be Trumpies are going to be surrounded by accountability norms and gentle questioning and Socratic questioning, and they'll be less likely to fall down those rabbit holes. So this is the work of generations. It's going to take time, and I certainly don't imagine that my book is a magic wand that's going to instantly have the anti-vaxxers lining up. In fact, they're predisposed to reject. Towards the end of my book, I actually take the Socratic Method and develop it into something I called a mind vaccine. And when I wrote an article about that for Psychology Today, the right freaked out. They're like, "Oh man, these liberals, they want to vaccinate my mind now." So I don't lead with that fact. That's a late chapter for our distant ancestors to work on. I wrote this book for people 1,000 years from now, but maybe you can appreciate some of it.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. I really was touched by your story about the young girl who gave up college because she was afraid of hellfire. And it brings up a question in my mind. I'm a big Socratic fan, but we talk so much about ideas, and there is huge charisma and emotion that is attached to the other side. And it seems to draw more attention, more followers, And I wonder how we can use emotion. I think about Spock versus,
versus Bones.
Yes, and how we can get that emotion behind this to give it some power, because most people are not convinced by logic.
Beautiful question. You can't fight, what is it? Sometimes, get my metaphors wrong here. Plato argued that if you try to rein in the unruly horse, he imagined that the reason was like the charioteer that's trying to control two unruly horses, one of them desire and one of them passion for glory or something like that. And he argued that reason alone can't do the job. What reason has to do is enlist the support of the horse that likes glory, gentle that horse, and have that horse help to calm the unruly desires that might otherwise disorder our lives. So Plato knew, and psychologists since have basically been argued that reason needs to enlist the passions to control the passions, to simplify it. Jonathan Haidt wrote a wonderful book called The Happiness Hypothesis and another one called The Righteous Mind, where he argues that the passions are like an elephant, and reason is like the puny little human sitting on the back of the elephant trying to tell the elephant where to go, when in fact the elephant's going to go wherever it darn wants to. And it's not easy to tame the passions with reason, but it's not impossible, especially if reason can enlist some of the more noble passions to constrain the less noble passions. At least that's Plato's simplified version.
What's your take on this? How do we get passion behind this so that I feel like the elephant is in charge right now.
Yeah, me too. And it scares me, right? It feels out of control. I think we should advocate for a kind of reason that doesn't seem dry and desiccated and purely logical. For me, reason is something worth being passionate about, and reasoning done right gives the passions a place. It seems to me that moral argumentation, for example, takes basic moral intuitions about right and wrong, which come from sentiments, and it gives them a voice in the conversation about what we should do. So when you think about moral argumentation, our values, our passions have a role to play in that conversation. And I want to help people let go of the idea that reason is all about shutting down the emotions so that they don't have a voice. What they're really about is giving our emotions a voice, but making sure that they're not always the first and the last voice, to slow things down, calm things down, and give our higher brain function a chance to think through the possible consequences of acting on those passions. So it's a practice. I mean, again, philosophers for thousands of years have basically been saying you kind of have to train your mind to listen to that little voice that says, wait a second here, let's slow this down and think about that. And our culture is so much forgotten that ancient wisdom to the point where it feels really out of control and scary. But unruly passions have divided nations many, many times in human history, and humanity has recovered. And new enlightenments have taken place when people have rediscovered reason and wisdom. And I think there's still time to do that for us. I'm sorry I don't have a simpler answer, but the book might give you a more complete answer than I'm able to give now. Thank you.
One more question.
So I'd like to take issue a little bit with your idea against relativity, because I think what's a good idea and a bad idea? I think those have been kind of something that humanity has been struggling with for millennia.
That is true.
So I read your book quite some time ago, and I don't remember all the details, but I remember when when I read it, I'm going like, here's a real humanist writing about these issues. I felt that you took the humanist stance in terms of the humanist value that we care about all people and the planet and valuing people. And so I'd like you to say a little bit more about, because I know you are a humanist and you identify as one, and a lot of academics I think are, but they don't identify that way, and you do.
In Europe, more of them do. In America, fewer.
Yeah, but so like, how does that inform your work? And don't you think that we do have to put that out there when we're talking about good ideas and bad ideas? Of we need a good idea for the 21st century. Well, we needed it for the last few centuries in a global world where we have to care about one another and the interconnectedness of all of us, which is really the humanist value that I think contemporary humanist organizations like our own and many others put forward. That has to be part of the basis for what we're doing, as opposed to, because if you don't have that, what's the standard? Where do you have that standard for a good idea versus a bad idea, and what we're inoculating ourselves against?
Right. So, we have to care about each other's welfare. I think we have to care about the planet and the particularly the conscious life forms on it. One of the research projects I've been engaged in for a number of years is to actually think about how we might start thinking scientifically about what matters. What would it mean to think responsibly and in evidentially constrained ways about what truly matters? Turns out you can interpret a whole bunch of ethical philosophy as actually trying to come up with a naturalistic, non-supernaturalistic ways of thinking about what matters. So when John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham developed utilitarianism, they asked themselves the question, ultimately, what really matters? And they concluded that Mill said, it's basically happiness that matters. It's the well-being, I like to modify that slightly to the well-being of conscious creatures matters. If anything matters inherently, it's the well-being of conscious creatures. And if anything matters indirectly, it's because it enhances the well-being of conscious creatures or matters negatively by detracting from it. So I think we can actually learn to think much more clearly about right and wrong and gain a sense of shared purpose. I think we can develop a shared sense of what matters, and that's really what's lacking in a highly polarized world, right? It's like, we conservatives think these things matter, and you liberals think those things matter, and oh well, our basic value premises are different, so why bother talking to one another? That's the attitude that prevails now. But what if we all just kind of set aside our preconceptions and said, all right, well, let's think this through together and actually think about what really matters and see if we can come up with shared standards of ways of deciding these questions. I think ultimately utilitarianism, the consequentialist ethical philosophy developed by Mill and Bentham, is an attempt to say, hey, there are in fact semi-scientific ways of determining what's right and what's wrong, and it involves trying to figure out the consequences of a given course of action or a given policy for the well-being of conscious creatures. And if there's any realistic way, realism-based way of settling these questions, it's got to start there. It doesn't make settling the complex political questions simple, but at least it gives us a common framework for working through them. Right now, there's too many dogmatic people who won't even meet us there, us humanists there, to have that conversation, and that's a problem.
Well, thank you so much for a wonderful evening.
Thank you, Howard.
Book signing in the lobby. Also remember, next Thursday, Day of Reason in the morning at the Vault at the State Capitol. Food, drinks, many legislators talking to us about secular advocacy. Also, Sarah Levin will be there. Also, Wednesday night at Ladonia. Please come. Excellent food and drink. Starts at 5 o'clock It's not too far from here, 241 Harrison. See you then. Thanks much, everyone.